Okay, well, I want to spend a few moments today talking to a friend of mine. I came across Mary about 2 years ago when she was on a forum that I joined, and I was very impressed with her views on the scriptures, her love for the Lord, and her quick and witty responses to the numerous posts. After this forum, she went over to GodTube, where I met up with her again, and I'm happy to say that she's now on YouTube, and you will know her as Thessalonian71. So welcome, Mary. Nice to be talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
And just like to spend a few minutes with you, if I may, first of all, getting your testimony, how you became a Christian and what your background is, please.
Okay, well, I've only been Christian, it will be 3 years this July. And I had thought growing up that I was a Christian. Because I was raised in a Catholic family. We didn't go to church every week, but we did. We considered ourselves churchgoers. Whenever we visited my family in Ireland, of course, we'd be more diligent and devoted because that was, the done thing. But my knowledge of what a Christian was at the time, while I was growing up, was very limited. I remember trying to read the Bible, and I just couldn't get into it. I used to say the rosary, and I sort of gradually became more attracted to Mary, really, than anyone else. I was, quite fond of the idea of different saints that you could talk to, and I liked the idea of having some kind of big mama in the sky that I could talk to. But never really knew much about Jesus. Jesus was always, to me, he was a baby in arms, or he was, the dead body in the famous pictures that you'll see of the Pieta, which is it's a depiction of Mary with Jesus's body in her arms after he's taken down from the cross. So I had a very emasculated view of Jesus. I didn't really know him either as my saviour or as, the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. He was always, an infant or a man, but he was never really God to me. So I wasn't Christian. I thought I was. Went to university and got involved in the occult while I was there. But it took me a while to realise that is what was happening. I was Catholic rep for the first year I was there, even though I was openly, living in sin is the expression. But I was with a man I wasn't married to. But nobody had a problem with me being the Catholic rep for the college. By the time I was in my second year, I was sort of drifting away from any pretense of faith, and was getting quite intrigued by, pagan manifestations of the Divine Mother. I started recognising Mary in Greek mythology and things like that. So by the time I finished university, I wouldn't have called myself a witch at that point, but I was definitely by then a pagan. And shortly after my son was born, I deliberately sort of aligned myself with witchcraft, and I was a witch then for 10 years until I was saved, totally unexpectedly.
So I just want to go back a minute, if I may. You said that you had more of a perception of Mary than you did of Jesus, and certainly something I've experienced talking to other Catholics, that Mary is somehow elevated in the church, sometimes over Christ. And what I was going to say to you was, why do you think that some Christians, or some Catholics, I should say, have this obsession, this sort of desire to be close to Mary and not to come to the Son? What are your thoughts on that?
I think deep down, everybody knows that if you come to God, if you come to Christ, you're going to have to give yourself up, and He is going to change you. It's not, I think that's possibly something that everybody knows on some instinctive level. The thing about mothers is that they're much more tolerant than fathers. A father won't tolerate the same level of disobedience in his sons as a mother will, typically. I think it's because people just sort of see Mary as this sort of embracing, loving, forgiving, etc., etc., and she doesn't judge. Whereas we know that Jesus, when he comes again, he's going to come again as judge. First time he didn't come to judge the world; he came to save. But we know that whenever we stand in front of his throne, whether he comes first or whether we die, we're all going to stand in front of him. And when that happens, every knee will bow and every tongue confess, and he will judge us. And people are scared of that, so I think they would sooner have a pseudo Jesus. And I think that's why Mary is popular. I think the other thing as well is that children are encouraged to see her as a kind of a great mother in the sky who's always there for them, and women are encouraged to sympathise with her because they sort of see her as having shared a lot of their experiences. I mean, all of that's true. I mean, I have a great deal of. I mean, she's a wonderful example. But I see Mary as someone who. I mean, you can actually see the moment at which Mary became born again. When in Scripture, when she says to the angel, she says, "Let it be done to me according to thy word. Behold, the handmaid of the Lord." She actually submits herself, and she knows that she's a sinner, and that's why she rejoices in her salvation.
Sure. Well, just want to add a couple of footnotes to that for those that don't know. We're currently in May, and May is the month of Mary for Catholics. 2 months out of the year are given to Devotion of Mary, October and May. And also the last Pope, John Paul II, who was known as Karol Wojtyla, his Polish name before he was ordained as John Paul II, lost his mother when he was very, very young. And there's a story of his father calling Carol into the bedroom, said, "Your mother's died. Mary is now your mother." And I know for a lot of Catholics that, especially in Poland, very poor third world country, that in those days life was very tough. And he had this, this sort of very close bond to the Mary of Catholicism. And that when he was shot by the Bulgarian Secret Service back in, I think it was the early 80s, he gave Mary the credit for saving him. And the bullets that were taken out of him by a surgeon, he took to, I think it was Medjugorje, I think, and dedicated it to Mary. So he was very much in tune with Mary of Catholicism. And of course, one of the final points on the last Pope, when he died, they even engraved the M on his coffin. So his whole life as a Catholic was very much given to Mary, which of course isn't the Mary of the Bible, Mary of Roman Catholicism, which is another subject which maybe we'll cover on another occasion. So you're at college, you've got involved with the occult. I think you also said that you had some connections with feminism as well. Do you want to spend a little bit of time on that, please?
Well, sort of intellectually, I was sort of rebelling. I mean, it's interesting to me now to look at it, and it says in Scripture that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. And I think when you look at it, all sort of rebellion against God will lead to worshipping something other than him, which is what it says in Romans, Romans 1.
Yeah.
So I sort of saw Mary as a kind of a mentor, for Christian women, when I was considering myself to be a Christian. So I didn't, I was never interested in being a priest or anything of that ilk. I was never interested in entering a convent or anything like that, but I didn't see why other women shouldn't be priests. I couldn't sort of see why the Bible said that women and men had different roles in the church. I just assumed that was because the Bible was written by sexist men. And so I would kind of balk and rebel against lots of things in the Bible because I thought I knew better. And one of the things that's interesting to me is the difference. After I truly became a Christian, I'd read passages that I used to rebel against, and they make perfect sense to me now. and some of them I'm actually really grateful for. You know, verses which before I would have thrown out. A great consolation now. But I mean, I would say that you know, if you're going to send your kids to university, you can probably expect them to come into contact with a lot of this kind of thinking, which is, you know, can obviously cause a problem for people.
Sure. So you've gone from that side of things into the occult. How were you indoctrinated into that? How did that come about?
Well, I was studying classical literature, and I was reading a lot of. I was reading. I've always been a big reader, but I was reading a lot of stuff from ancient Greece, and I suppose subconsciously I was looking for something to. I couldn't tell you how it started, but I remember when I first realised that you know, the triple-headed dog that guards hell in Greek mythology. I think the anglicised version is Cerberus, and she's Kerberos in Greek. But when I realised that this was originally, it was a depiction of the triple-headed goddess Hecate, which is a goddess of the witches. And I remember thinking that it was interesting that there were so many trinities in Greek mythology, and that most of these trinities were female. You know, so you had Athene and Artemis and Hera, and you had the three fates and all the rest of it, and even the muses. You had a triple trinity. You had 9 muses. So I started looking at this kind of thing, and then I came to the conclusion, which of course I completely disagree with now, that the Trinity doctrine in Christianity was just a kind of a version of Greek Trinitarianism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think in the Greek culture, wasn't it? They had the idea of 3 gods.
Yeah, they didn't. I didn't understand the Trinity. You see, I didn't understand the actual Christian doctrine of the Trinity anyway. But what was interesting was when I came back and I told my mother after my first term, I told her that I'd discovered that there was a trinities in Greek mythology, and you know, she actually said, you know, I wish you hadn't gone to that university. She was quite upset for me, and she said, you know, don't you think that if God is who He says He is, that all the demons out there know who He is, and they know He's a Trinity, and that's why they sort of make these stories up. And I was quite annoyed with her because I thought she was being simple-minded and naive. But of course, since then I've realised that she was onto something. But no, I didn't understand the Trinity at all. I mean, to be honest, I don't think any of us do.
Yeah.
But certainly I had a very erroneous idea, because I had read scripture by this point, but I hadn't studied it or prayed about it or, you know, thought about it outside of my own little boxes. I'd read it to prove something to myself. I wouldn't read it to see what it actually said. I think a lot of people do that.
Sure. Would you say that when you were at Oxford, you met anybody at all who was born again?
I did, yes. We had a Christian union there, which you know, the rest of us, especially the Catholic students, we used to refer to them as muscular Christians because they all seemed so cheerful and, you know, happy and in your face. And I mean, They weren't actually in your face. They were just, you know, pleased, you know, happy. You know, they were genuinely confident and knew where they were going and wanted to share the good news with people. And they were, you know, really lovely people. But of course, we all looked down our noses at them. But I did know several true Christians who were very patient and forbearing with me.
Did they ever say anything to you, which now that you're saved, you can sort of think, yes, you know, I can see now? I mean, were you ever under any sort of conviction, you know, as a sort of a Catholic living in sin, dabbling in the occult and feminism? Did you ever feel that these born-again people, you know, were pulling you up, if you will, you know, trying to witness to you?
I remember one occasion when I was talking to a lady, really, really good Christian woman, who, if you could pray for her, actually, because she's having a difficult time at the moment. But this particular woman was the only person who ever sort of said in my face, as it were. I mean, I don't mean in my face, but she said straight, to me, and she said it very compassionately and lovingly, that homosexuality was a sin. No, I wasn't in a relationship of that sort at the time, but I had been in the past. And I remember I was just gobsmacked. I couldn't believe that she'd say something so outrageous. And then of course she got the whole, you're a bigot and you're a this and you're a that and all the rest of it. And she just, she didn't apologise, she didn't back down, she didn't take back what she said, and she didn't actually say anything that should have offended me. She just, and I remember after I became Christian, I think it was 3 days afterwards, I suddenly realised, it suddenly dawned on me that I actually believed as she did. It's like God had kind of changed something in my head without my even knowing it.
Right. So what would you say to somebody who would say that you're born a homosexual? How would you respond to that?
Well, we're all born sinners, but the expression that sin takes is going to be different in each person. Some people are born with a tendency toward alcoholism. Some people are born with a tendency toward anger. And it's quite possible that some people are born with a tendency toward homosexuality. But to be honest, I think I doubt that. I mean, I've known a lot of people in that lifestyle. And I would say without exception, they've all had some kind of trauma or dysfunction in their background. So I mean, a lot of homosexual men, for example, this is known. I mean, a lot of homosexual men have overbearing mothers and absent fathers, and so what they're trying to do is they're trying to kind of replace a father figure, and it gets muddled up in their heads, sort of. And a lot of lesbians have had abuse issues when they were younger, which caused them to sort of fear male intimacy, and therefore they seek to replace it with something else. But I mean, I think that because two people of the same gender love each other doesn't mean that they're homosexual. I think nowadays lust has got muddled up a great deal with the idea of genuine friendship and love. So I would say I'm not I'm not the expert on it or anything, but I would say in my experience, I haven't really known anybody who's homosexual who was born that way.
Sure. I'll just say a couple of things. Yeah, just say a couple of things if I may. We get a lot of correspondence at our ministry from people saying that Jesus never condemned homosexuality, therefore we shouldn't, as Bible-believing Christians. But with the same argument, Jesus never condoned it either. And he does say in Matthew 19 that God made man and woman, and let no man put them asunder. So the position that we would take is that the original creation between a man and a woman is upheld and affirmed by Christ. It's very clear in the Old Testament, and Paul echoes that throughout all of his epistles, that the sin of homosexuality and lesbianism isn't something which a Christian should be deviling in. And so you back to university, and who actually approached you to get involved with the occult? Can you remember roughly how that began? Or
well, I'd been sort of involved in occulty things since I was very young anyway. I was considered as a child, people say, oh, she's got the sight and things, so I felt quite flattered that I was this gifted individual. So I was doing things like scrying and reading palms and things like that.
What's scrying, for those that don't know?
Well, it's a form of fortune telling. It's a little bit like what you see whenever people, the kind of the jokey thing on telly where they look in a crystal ball, but it's looking at reflections usually on water or wine or something of that ilk, and you sort of you go into a sort of trance-like state, and you sort of start interpreting the images that you see.
So were you taught this, or did you just pick it up as you went along?
I picked that up as I went along.
Right. And was it accurate, what you were what sort of
It was
finding out?
pretty accurate. Actually, to be honest, I can remember exactly when I decided how I figured out how to scry. I was about 10 or so, and I was reading Yeats. The poet W.B. Yeats. I was reading one of his plays, and there's a description of scrying in one of his plays. Or there's a description of somebody seeing a vision when looking at a reflective surface, and so I decided to experiment with that, and it worked quite rapidly.
And did that lead to black magic at all? I mean, how did it? What was the springboard to take you from scrying to going deeper into the occult? Can you remember?
Well, I picked up a book. I picked up some occult literature in the library, and I read it, and I decided to devise my own sort of self-initiation. But I would say it was sort of speaking to people who I knew were witches, and they would sort of describe various things they were getting up to. They didn't exactly seek to convert me. They just sort of they sought to sort of give me the impression that that was my calling. So I was influenced by them, but in the end it was a case of I sort of sat down and I worked out a ritual for myself, because a lot of Wicca is make it up as you go along.
And what's the difference between white witchcraft and black magic?
Well,
Is there a difference?
I think that there's perhaps there's less difference than people realise, but I think that in fact I would say somebody is perhaps in less spiritual danger if they're practising darker magic, because at least they're acknowledging the fact that what they're involved in is evil. I consider myself to be. I mean, I wouldn't use the term white witch. You don't get many Wiccans would use the expression sort of black or white, but they'd talk about the right hand path or the left hand path. But I considered myself to be on the right hand path. I was hippie, sort of vegan, sweetness and light. Let's save the environment and all the rest of it. And so I assumed that I was on the the light side of the force, as it were. But I would actually argue that that's a demonic deception. I mean, okay, so I wasn't running around cursing people on a regular basis, and I wasn't sort of knowingly invoking demonic forces. But not having really been involved in black magic, to use the expression, I don't know as much about that as I do about the sort of the greener side of things. But I would say that it's almost more a personality difference. Some people are more inclined towards darker expressions.
Right. So did you have any involvement with like a Ouija boards or seances?
When I was at school, I was involved with Ouija board.
Right.
But didn't like that particularly. So didn't do that very often. But I think that does sort of attract things into your life that you don't want anything to do with.
Sure.
I mean, the way I would sort of talk about it now, if somebody was to ask, about sort of involvement in witchcraft and or involvement in the occult, where basically you're asking for, forbidden knowledge and all the rest of it, and you're asking for something outside of your sphere, your proper sphere. I think the big problem is that you end up, it's almost as though you're standing on top of a hill, jumping up and down, waving your arms in the middle of a German air raid, waving a light in the air, saying, come and get me. You don't actually know what those forces are, so you don't want to be sort of jumping around making yourself vulnerable. Mm. And it's that's I think that's what any kind of involvement, whether you're going to a medium and the medium's telling you sort of things, you're basically inviting unknown entities, and why do you assume that they're going to be truthful or honourable or have your best interests at heart? It's like, whenever you tell children about stranger danger, and people sort of, they take that seriously when it's children and it's sort of actual, humans out there who are the danger. But nobody seems to take it seriously whenever it's, whenever it's entities that aren't human. And
Sure.
I find that very strange.
What do you say to your typical witch or pagan who says, well, we don't believe in Satan, and therefore what we do has nothing to do with him. You know, we believe in worshipping Mother Earth and we're not hurting anybody. How would you convince that person that what they're actually doing is being in communication with unclean and familiar spirits? What would you say to them, Mary?
Well, I don't think I can persuade anybody. I tend to talk from my own experience, because obviously they know where I'm coming from. I would say that just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean that something isn't real. I mean, for example, I might decide I don't believe in elephants, but you know, there's still elephants in the world. So I mean, what I would sort of try and persuade people that there is such a thing as objective reality, and there are such things as absolute truths, and that you can't just make up reality as you go along. And that then becomes a philosophical argument, which a lot of people don't really enjoy. But I think that the main thing would be I would point out that you know, the devil's real. God is real. God is far more powerful than the devil, and that they, you know, if they should really, if they're as open-minded and free-spirited and courageous as they think they are, they ought to actually consider reading the Bible to see what it says, and they ought to actually pray, because you know, they obviously believe in some sort of spiritual reality, so why would they be afraid to pray to God?
Sure.
But I think the best thing you can do for pagans and witches and so on is you have to listen to them, because quite often you'll find that they have different views of what paganism is, even from each other. If you've got 5 witches in a room, you've usually got 7 different brands of witchcraft. Mm. So you need to listen to what people are saying, and I think also, very importantly, you need to just pray. Sometimes God will tell you what to say. You know, sure. Sometimes something will come to you that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of, and that will get through more than you could imagine.
Now, at the same time as being involved with this, you also had an interest in animal rights as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
With your late husband, and we'll come to him in a moment. Try and pull all this together, if you can, for us, Mary. Try and explain the philosophy behind feminism, Darwinism, and animal rights. And please then tell us about how you were able to witness to these people that you'd known for a long time once you got saved.
Well, what happened was I always had a sort of intellectual problem with Darwinism, even when I wasn't, you know, when I actually started looking into it, because in our first year at university we had to read Origins of Species, and we had to talk about how it influenced, you know, the change in philosophy in, you know, Victorian times, and, you know, it influenced Tennyson, so you'd get Tennyson writing something like nature red in tooth and claw. So you didn't have this romantic sort of idea of creation, and, you know, sort of like Eden was being shoved ever further into the distance. So I remember reading Origin of Species, and I remember talking with some of the Christians, you know, the genuine Christians, and that's actually something I remember, you know, when you ask, did they ever witness to me in ways? I remember talking to a guy who was a molecular biologist, and he was telling me that he did not believe that Darwin was right, and so he was going into all of the details as to why he couldn't believe that. And I mean, in the end, I just remember he was sort of sitting there looking at pictures of creatures like stick insects, and he was saying, at what point did this stick insect so resemble a twig that it had any evolutionary advantage over the slightly fatter, non-sticky insect it's supposedly related to? He said it was either always like that, or, you know, there's no way that you could get from A to B. So I mean, that was one example, and he was looking at things like the insides of cells. So if anybody's listening to this, a very good book, which came out after I was at uni, the very good book you can look out for is called Darwin's Black Box, and it's talking about, you know, basically the biological impossibility of evolution because of irreducible complexity. So I was never really a Darwinian, which was very unusual in the circles I was in. I think people just assumed I was a bit mental, so I didn't really talk about it. I couldn't understand where the world came from, so I preferred not to think about it. But a lot of people in animal rights are obviously influenced by Darwin, but equally a lot of people in the vivisection industry are influenced by Darwin. So you have one group of people on one side arguing, don't experiment on animals because you wouldn't experiment on humans, and sort of arguing that the animals were so similar to us that therefore it was wrong to experiment on them. And then you had people on the other side arguing that it was okay to experiment on animals because they were not as evolved as us, but that they were close kin to us because of evolution. And I think in the end both sides had sort of got caught up in a sort of one of these debates that's never going to get resolved. It says in the Bible that God created every creature to reproduce according to its kind. So all of the canines and all of the felines and all of the different bird species, etc., are descended from something which God created in that kind, which is why sort of assuming that animals are morally equivalent to us is, obviously it's not based on the Bible. And arguing that they're biologically equivalent to us, which a lot of scientists do, is also not based on the Bible. So I think there's a whole area there that people, we get lost because we don't look at what God says about the situation. Anyway, sorry, I've rambled.
No, it seems to me that people going to the animal right movement are predominantly Darwinists, and therefore they see animals as their brethren, and of course that becomes their own sort of religion, that they're out to save the earth. And of course we've discussed this before many times, that a lot of people, without realising, are actually post-millennial. They're trying to make this a perfect world, and of course you can't make a cursed world perfect.
Well, I think that, again, sort of deep down psychologically, we all want to return to Eden.
Without the king.
Without the king, yeah. And I think that's the big problem, is that people, you can't get past the angel with a sword. You can't sort of return to this sort of idyllic pre-Diluvian world or anything, but you can, or at least people believe that they can create, a new heaven and a new earth. But as we know, we've got sin in us, so anything that we create is going to become corrupted, and every single political system and every single sort of social movement ends up being corrupted by our inherent sinfulness. So when I started being involved in animal rights, I was a lot more compassionate, I think, than I was later on. And the longer I was involved with it, the more angry I got that nobody was listening. The more frustrated I got that, people didn't seem to care. And the more self-righteous I got, the more intolerant of other people. And it did, in the end, become a religious crusade for me, which I think happens with a lot of people.
Sure. And how long were you involved with the animal rights for?
I would say very actively, from 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
And just tell us now how you got saved and how that affected your relationship with your husband, of course, and people that you've been associating with for a number of years.
Well, my husband had been a lifelong atheist. He was born disabled. He had spina bifida, and he sort of became an atheist when he was 10. He very clearly remembered the occasion, and he was looking at a picture of I think it's quite a famous picture of a child in Biafra, in the Biafran famine, standing there with his wee belly stuck out and, bones. And my husband was in hospital at the time with Sydenham's Korea, I think it was called. And he looked at this picture of this little boy and he thought, if there's a God, then how can he let this happen? How can he let this? He says either God doesn't love us, or he's useless, or he doesn't exist. And so my husband decided that the only thing he could bear to live with was that there wasn't a God. So he actually made a conscious choice out of the three options. He thought they were the only three options. God is helpless, God is cruel, or God doesn't exist. So he picked the atheist position because the other two positions would have upset him too much, I think. And, for the next 30-odd years was very militantly atheist. In fact, he said to me that if he wasn't involved in animal rights, he'd be campaigning against religion. But when we married, he didn't object to me being a Wiccan. He obviously thought it was a superstitious nitwit, but he didn't object to that in the same way. But when I became Christian, he was really profoundly upset. I think it felt to me at the time as though he thought I'd somehow betrayed him. And interestingly, later, when he became Christian himself, he said that he had felt as though, one moment he had this wife who just loved him, and, she was, and then the next minute he's got to compete with this other man, and this other man is God. So I think perhaps a lot of men have that feeling. So I think, any women listening to this should bear that in mind, and also don't, my best advice is never nag your husband. You can't nag anybody into the kingdom. Just pray for them and love them, and, let God do the rest. So, but I became Christian on a Monday. The previous day, my husband had been in hospital. He'd suddenly become extremely sick and was dying all of a sudden out of the blue, and I was in such a state of shock I didn't know what to do. And it sounds silly, but I heard a voice, I don't know what it was, and it just said, "What will it take for you to pray?" And I just, I kind of bowed my head into my hands and said, "Dear God, please God, help me God." And it was the first time I'd prayed, probably since I'd been a child. And I didn't even know particularly who I was praying to. And the thing that gets me is that I was, at the time of this prayer, I was a witch, and, my husband was an atheist, and God answered the prayer, despite the fact that we completely didn't deserve it to be answered. My husband's blood pressure at the time was over 240, and his heart rate was over 240, and his blood pressure was dropped through the floor, and his oxygen saturation levels just kept dropping, and the doctors were saying they couldn't even move him because they were afraid he'd have a stroke and die. So, there just didn't seem to be any hope. He was purple, and there was nothing to be done. And within 5 minutes of me praying, everything started to go back to normal. And then he opened his eyes, he sat up, and he said, "What am I doing in hospital, Mary?" So the next day I went in to a Christian bookshop, spoke with a lovely lady in there, and she prayed with me, told me about Jesus and gave me a Bible, and that was a Monday. And since then, everything changed.
Of course, your husband bounced back. He didn't die straight away.
No, he had 18 months after that. And we had the sort of arguments. It took me a while to sort of realise that scriptural counsel for wives is best. I tried to sort of argue him into the kingdom and, sort of prove to him logically and, exegete this and theologise that. And it wasn't actually my job to be his instructor, as it were. But Peter says, that a wife can win without a word. And I remember one of the most amazing things to me was when my husband got very cross with me and said he didn't want me reading the Bible, where he could see me reading it and he didn't want to see me praying. And so I went off, I was upset, and I locked myself in the bathroom, and I opened up the Bible and I read a passage, I think it's in Corinthians, where Paul talks about how women should submit to their husbands and meekness, and then I read the passage from Peter when he gives advice to wives as well. And the advice wasn't, sort of bang your husband over the head with scripture, drag him to church whether he wants to go or not. The advice was, love him, obey him, pray for him, and leave it to God. And the interesting thing was that this was about a week before Christmas. He'd forbidden me from reading the Bible in front of him. And on Christmas Day, he was actually asking me to read to him from the Bible.
Amazing.
Which was astonishing. And by the first fortnight of January, he had actually professed Christ. So then
Amazing.
he lived that from then until July, and after that he basically he would talk to everybody
About Christ.
about Christ. Yeah.
Yeah.
When he died, a lot of people came to his funeral because he'd been a campaigner for such a long time and was very well known and well respected. And so hundreds of people turned up to his funeral in Manchester. And it wasn't there wasn't a minister or anything like that. It was just people turned up, and it would have been a secular funeral basically if my son and myself hadn't been converted. But we had two Christian sisters. The lady who prayed for me first and gave me my first Bible, and a friend of hers came down, and they were praying. They were praying in the crowd, so that when I stood up and started telling people about our conversion as a family and what God had done for us, and everybody just, I think they were just gobsmacked. Remember, one woman came up to me afterwards and she says, Mary, you could have stripped and run around here painted purple and I wouldn't have been as shocked.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lady who had just come. This is one of my favourite stories. A Chinese lady married to a friend of my husband's had been in China visiting her mother when she found out, that there was a funeral to attend. So she was going through the airport at, I think it was Beijing, and a Christian came up and gave her a leaflet, and so she started calling it a very dangerous thing to do in China, of course, but she started calling him names and so on. And the Christian said, you can go to the ends of the world and someone will stand up and profess Christ. So she got on the plane and she went to, she went back to England and, rested up overnight and things, went to the funeral the next day, and just couldn't get over the fact that, the last time she'd seen me I'd been a witch. Couldn't get over the fact that I stood up and professed Christ. And she has since become a Christian.
Marvellous.
So God will do amazing things. He'll sort of use the most minute details in your life, and he'll put you in places where you wouldn't have expected to be. Because the year I was saved, I remember on Good Friday, I said to somebody, I don't care if your God's real, I don't care if it's true, I'll never worship him, I'd sooner go to hell. And I believed it when I said it. So, God will, God is really much more powerful than our little pride and all those things.
And I think it's worth also mentioning that your mother-in-law became a Christian as well through your witness.
Well, I think as well through, obviously through her sons.
As well, yes.
Yeah, because she said to me, when Neil was very poorly, and he'd had, he'd nearly died. This was about a few months before he did die. And whenever, he was breathing and everything again, he asked me to let him phone his mother. And this was a couple of weeks after he was first saved, so it was a few months before he died. And I phoned his mother and I told her, Neil's a bit poorly, better turn your hearing aid up. But she spoke to him, and she's, the first thing that came out of his mouth, he's on his phone to his mum, he says, Mum, he says, I've seen Jesus. Meaning, he's met him, he knows him. Yeah. And my mother-in-law said to me, if anybody else on the planet had started talking to me about Jesus, she says, I wouldn't have believed them. She says, one thing I know about Neil is he never lied to me. She said he could be the naughtiest boy in the world and sort of, go places he wasn't supposed to and sort of climb trees and sort of drop things on policemen and stuff like that. When he, the way kids are naughty.
Yeah, of course.
He could be as naughty a boy as anybody else, but if he came back and she'd say, what have you been doing? He'd tell her. And she said he never lied to her. And she couldn't think why he'd make that story up. Why would he suddenly start talking about Jesus? She said, I thought if he was going to get religion, it would be Buddhism or something. She says, and instead he's telling me all about Jesus.
remarkable story.
But the nice thing was, I mean, she was at his grave on his birthday, I think it was. No, it was shortly after Christmas, and she was this last Christmas, and she was feeling upset for him. You know, this is nearly 2 years since he died. You know, obviously she was his only, you know, he was her only child, and so you can imagine what must be going through her heart. And so she's standing at his gravesite, and she said she suddenly remembered the last thing he said to her, which was, "Mum, follow me." You know, because he did keep trying to tell her, and she was standing there thinking about it, and she suddenly thought he was so peaceful and so confident when he died. And she said she suddenly just felt a sense of real comfort, and she knew that what he was saying was true. Because she was there when he died. She was holding one hand and I was holding the other. And he opened his eyes and he looked between the two of us and he smiled, and then he was just gone. And of course at her age she'd seen a lot of people die, but I don't think she'd seen anyone die quite like that.
Mm. Well, amazing story, Mary, and I want to thank you for talking to me today about this.
Okay.
Both you and Seamus are wonderful Christians, and is there anything else you want to say before we conclude this conversation?
I wanted to say that I know there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who will be cross. I know how angry I used to be about Christians, sort of coming out with fairy tales as I thought of them at the time. And I know that there's going to be a lot of people got sort of kind of an anger, and it's going to make you want to sort of pick holes in my testimony and sort of, or say that the whole thing's a lie. But the thing is that there is objective truth. There is somebody that you can talk to if you're not afraid to talk to him. There's nothing to stop anybody listening to this from going and kneeling down and honestly saying, God, if you're there, let me know. And if you really do want to know, and if you really do ask him, he really will tell you. Because, there's no way that you'll ever know he's there unless you kind of take the blinkers off and stop being afraid of him. My husband said to me once, after he was Christian, he said, now that I think of it, he said, I should have realised I was so angry with God. He said, I was never angry with Santa Claus. I was never angry with the Tooth Fairy. He said, I was angry with God. So if anybody's listening to this and they're angry at the message and they're angry, they're angry and they hate God, you can't hate somebody you don't believe in. So if you find yourself angry or, responding to this emotionally, take it up with God, because he's a lot bigger than us and he's actually with you now and he can answer all your questions.
Absolutely. And how would you explain to the listeners to get saved? What's the plan of salvation, Mary? What do they need to do to be born again?
Well, my son was asked this at school a couple of weeks ago, just before he had a serious incident and, ended up in hospital. But my son shared this with children at school. A boy said, does Jesus love me too? Or does he not like me? Taking the mickey, because my son had been trying to share the gospel. And my son said, all you have to do is love him back. Now, I don't know, you obviously can't make yourself love somebody. But what you can do is you can go to him and you can say, I know that I'm a sinner, because we are all sinners. I know that I have sinned. I know that I have done wrong. I am really sorry. And, please, Lord, forgive me. And let me know that you are real. And that's how my son was saved. That's how I was saved. That's how my husband was saved. It's how everybody I know was saved, was that they came to Jesus and they repented of their sins. And they asked him to come into their lives. And it sounds cliched, and it might sound like you don't know how to do it, but just get on your knees. Or, even sort of as you walk along, just talk to Jesus, because he is there. And he is listening and he wants to hear from you, and just say, Lord, I know that I have sinned. Some listeners out there will say, oh, I've never sinned. But in your heart of hearts that you've sinned. If every single thing you had ever thought or said or done was to be replayed on a big screen in the centre of town, you'd never go to that town again. We've all got hidden things in us that are just horrible, and we just can't get rid of them ourselves. So we just have to surrender and give it all up and say, you know, Lord Jesus, please forgive me, I'm a sinner. Save me, and that'll do it.
Mary, that's a wonderful testimony. I thank you very much for talking to us today, and as always, blessings to both you and your son, Seamus.
Thank you.